The morning Abigail Langston drove 6 of the finest quarter horses ever bred in the territory of New Mexico into the dusty town of Cimarron. Every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and stared, and not a single one of them could have said with certainty whether he was staring at the horses or at her. It was the spring of 1878, and the land around Cimarron was the kind of beautiful that broke a person's heart a little every time they looked at it. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains rose in jagged violet lines against a sky so blue it almost looked painted, and the Cimarron River cut through the valley in ribbons of silver light. The town itself was rougher than the landscape that cradled it, a collection of sun-bleached storefronts, a livery, a saloon that never truly closed, a general store with a sagging porch, and the ever-present smell of horse sweat and sawdust that seemed to cling to everything west of the Mississippi. Abigail rode at the front of her small herd on a bay mare named Duchess, the lead rope of the other 5 horses trailing behind her in a neat line. She sat asaddle the way some women sat in parlor chairs, with complete and total authority, as though the whole arrangement had been designed specifically to accommodate her. She wore a dove-gray riding skirt, a cream blouse with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a battered wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to her father before it belonged to her. Her dark auburn hair was braided and pinned at the back of her neck, and her jaw was set in the particular way of a woman who has already decided how the day is going to go and intends to hold the world to that agreement. She was 26 years old. She had been running the Langston ranch alone for 2 years, ever since her father, Thomas Langston, had died of a fever that swept through the valley in the winter of 1876. Her older brother Daniel had gone east to study law and had shown no inclination to come back, and her mother had passed when Abigail was only 12. So it had fallen to her, the land, the horses, the debts, the decisions. She had made peace with all of it. The land she loved fiercely. The horses she understood better than she understood most people. The debts she was working on. The decisions, well, those were the reason she was riding into Cimarron on this particular April morning, with 6 horses at her back, and a heart that was considerably more anxious than her face was letting on. The Langston Ranch sat on 300 acres of good grass land south of town, but the roof of the main house needed replacing. The south pasture fence had been compromised by a hard winter, and the bank note her father had taken out to purchase breeding stock 3 years ago was coming due at the end of May. She needed money, real money. And the horses she was bringing to sell today represented the best of what the ranch could produce: 6 young, healthy, well-trained quarter horses that could cut cattle, chase mustangs, or carry a rider across a mountain pass without complaint. They were worth a great deal to the right buyer. She just needed to find that buyer before the bank found her first. The auction had been announced 2 weeks prior. A broker named Clyde Harmon had ridden out to the Langston place personally to tell her about it, which meant either that he respected the quality of her stock or that he knew she was desperate enough to accept a low commission. Probably both. Harmon had set it up at the edge of the stockyards at the south end of town, and by the time Abigail arrived and tied her horses to the rail, there were already a dozen men milling around the yard with that particular brand of casual interest that men wore when they were actually very interested, but did not want anyone to know the extent of it. She recognized a few of them. Henderson Cole, who ran the largest cattle operation in Colfax County, and who had the budget to buy anything he wanted and the manners of a man who knew it. Jerome Platt, a horse trader out of Taos who had a reputation for reselling at twice the purchase price and who made no apology for it. A couple of ranchers from the northern valley whose names she knew by sight but not well. And then, standing slightly apart from the group near the corner of the fence, a man she did not recognize at all. He was leaning against the fence post with his arms folded, watching the horses rather than the men around him, which was her first indication that he might be worth paying attention to. He was tall, not extravagantly so, but enough that he stood out in any group, with the kind of broad shoulders that came from actual work rather than posturing, and a face that looked like it had been weathered by sun and wind and left more interesting for it. He wore a plain brown vest over a dark shirt, a hat pushed back just slightly on his head, and he had the unhurried stillness of a man who did not need to make noise to take up space. He looked to be somewhere in his early 30s, maybe 32 or 33, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and a jaw shadowed with a few days of beard that no one had gotten around to addressing. He was watching her Duchess with an expression she could only describe as recognition, the way a person looked at something they already understood and were simply confirming what they already knew. Abigail filed that away and turned her attention to the business at hand. Clyde Harmon called the auction to order at 9:30 with the efficiency of a man who charged by the hour. He was short and florid-faced with a gold watch chain across his vest that he touched every few minutes as though reassuring himself it was still there. He walked the buyers through Abigail's horses one by one, reciting their ages and training history, their lineages where she had provided documentation, their overall confirmation. He was good at his job, she had to admit. He made the horses sound exactly as good as they were, which was saying something. The bidding started brisk. Henderson Cole opened high on the first horse, a 3-year-old roan gelding with a particularly smooth lope, and established early that he intended to be taken seriously. Jerome Platt countered on most of the horses with the methodical patience of someone calculating resale margins in real time. The prices climbed in increments that made Abigail feel the first easing of the knot she had been carrying in her chest for the better part of 2 months. The unknown man bid on nothing for the first 3 horses. He just watched. His eyes moved from the horses to Abigail and back, with a kind of quiet attention that was not intrusive but was definitely present, and she found herself acutely aware of it in a way that irritated her slightly, because she did not have bandwidth for distractions today. The 4th horse was a 4-year-old chestnut mare named Copper, the one Abigail was most reluctant to sell, if she was being completely honest with herself. Copper was the smartest horse on the ranch, the kind of animal that seemed to understand things before you asked them, with a temperament so steady that Abigail had trusted her in situations she would not have trusted most people. But Copper was also healthy and young and prime breeding age, and selling her would put the ranch note nearly within reach. The bidding on Copper climbed fast. Cole wanted her. Platt wanted her. 2 of the other ranchers put in bids. The price rose past what Abigail had estimated, past what she had hoped for, into territory that was beginning to feel almost too good to be true. Then the unknown man unfolded himself from the fence post and spoke. $40, he said. His voice was low and even, and it cut through the noise of the auction the way a single clear note cuts through a room full of competing sounds. Everyone looked at him. The current bid was $65, and he had just offered $40, which made no practical sense and stopped the auction cold. Clyde Harmon blinked at him. "Sir, the current bid is $65. You'd need to bid at least $66 to be competitive." "I heard," the man said without any particular embarrassment. "I'm bidding $40. Cole laughed, short and dismissive. Jerome Platt made a sound of impatience. The auction moved on without further ceremony, and Henderson Cole acquired Copper for $72, which was a good price, and Abigail told herself she was satisfied. She was watching the unknown man as Cole completed the purchase, and she caught the exact moment he looked away from the mare. A brief contraction of something around his eyes, not quite frustration, more like the quiet acceptance of a man who knew the arithmetic of his situation and had offered what he could offer regardless. The last 2 horses sold quickly, and when the auction closed, Abigail walked her totals with Harmon and collected her payment, minus his commission, in a mixture of bank draft and coin that she tucked into the flat leather envelope she wore under her vest. She felt the relief settle through her bones like warmth. It was enough. With careful management, it was more than enough. The note could be paid, the roof could be fixed, And if she was sensible about the rest, she might even be able to put something back into building the herd for next year. She was tying the lead ropes of the horses that had not yet been collected by their new owners when she became aware that the unknown man was standing a few yards away, hat in his hands now, which she noted as a thing men only did when they were about to say something they were uncertain about. "Miss Langston," he said, not ma'am, not miss, her name, which meant he knew who she was. She straightened and looked at him directly. Up close he was even more striking than he had been at a distance, with gray eyes that were an unusual color, not pale and cold but deep and thoughtful, the color of river water in the late afternoon, and a face that seemed constructed for honesty rather than pretense. "You have me at a disadvantage," she said. "You know my name and I don't know yours." "Marshall Mercer," he said. "I have a small place about 12 miles south down toward the Rayado. I've been there about a year." He paused. "I wanted to apologize for that bid on your chestnut mare. I know it was irregular. I didn't mean to disrupt the proceedings." She studied him. "Why did you do it then?" He was quiet for a moment, and she got the sense that he was choosing his words with genuine care rather than performing the act of choosing them. "I've been saving to buy a good horse for about 6 months," he said. $40 is what I have. I knew it wasn't enough. But she's an exceptional animal, and I suppose I don't know what I thought. That maybe the world might work differently than it does, just the once." It was such an unexpectedly honest answer that Abigail found she had nothing immediate to say to it. She looked at him for a long moment, then she looked over her shoulder at Copper, who had not yet been collected by Henderson Cole and was standing at the rail with that characteristic expression of patient intelligence that Abigail had always found endearing. "Why do you need a good horse, Mr. Mercer?" she asked. "What kind of work do you do?" "I run about 40 head of cattle," he said. "On my own, mostly. I had a working horse that was good for the purpose, but she broke her leg in a gully last November and I had to put her down. I've been making do with a borrowed mule from my neighbor since then, which is workable but not ideal for the kind of terrain I run cattle across." A slight pause. "The Rayado country is rocky." She knew the Rayado country. She had ridden through it a dozen times. It was beautiful and demanding, and he was not wrong that it required a horse with both agility and steadiness. "What did you do before the Rayado?" she asked, because she was genuinely curious and because she was not yet sure why she was still standing here talking to him when she had a bank draft in her vest and a list of things to accomplish before she rode home. "A few different things," he said. "I was a deputy sheriff up in Trinidad for a while. Before that, I worked cattle drives out of Texas. I came out here because I wanted land of my own." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but the precursor to one. $40 is not a lot to show for 33 years. "It's an honest sum," she said, before she had decided to say it. He looked at her, then really looked at her, the way you look at someone when they've said something that landed somewhere unexpected. And for a moment neither of them said anything, and the sounds of the stockyard moved around them like the current of a river moves around two stones. "What will you do for a horse in the meantime?" she asked. "Keep borrowing the mule," he said, with a resigned acceptance that was almost funny. "Old Thomas next door doesn't mind." Abigail looked at Copper again. The mare turned her head at that moment and looked back, which was so characteristic of her that Abigail felt a small ache behind her sternum. She had not made this decision consciously. She had not weighed it against the practicalities or considered it from every angle the way she normally considered things. But sometimes a person encountered a situation where the sensible answer and the right answer were not the same thing, and in those moments, her father had always told her to trust the part of herself that knew the difference. "I'll sell her to you for $40, Abigail said. Marshall Mercer went very still. "Miss Langston," he said carefully, "Cole already bought her." "Cole bid on her," Abigail said. "The transaction isn't complete until the horse is collected and payment is formally transferred. Technically, she is still in my possession." She paused. "I am aware this will cause a difficulty with Mr. Cole, and I am prepared to manage that difficulty." I am also aware that I am taking a significant loss on this animal, and I want you to know I am making that choice with full understanding of what I am doing." "Why?" he asked. It was the same question she had asked him, and it deserved the same quality of answer. "Because she's a horse who needs someone who will understand her," Abigail said. "And I think you might." The precursor to the smile became the actual smile, and it transformed his face in a way that was frankly alarming given that she was supposed to be concentrating on a financial transaction. "I'll pay you back the difference," he said immediately. "Not today, but I will. I give you my word on that." "That isn't necessary," she said. "It is to me," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded once and went to find Clyde Harmon to explain that there had been a change in the disposition of the chestnut mare, which was not a conversation she was looking forward to in the slightest. Henderson Cole was, as expected, displeased. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted in commercial transactions, and he had a face that expressed displeasure the way a thunderhead expressed an incoming storm darkening visibly, and with significant warning of what was coming. He argued that the bid had been accepted, that the understanding was clear, that her behavior was irregular and unprofessional. Abigail agreed that it was irregular. She offered to refund his bid and apologize for the inconvenience. She did not budge on the decision. Cole was wealthy enough to find another good horse within the month and angry enough not to care about that in the moment. But she held her ground with the kind of quiet, unshakable certainty that tends to communicate itself more effectively than any argument. And eventually, Cole took his money back and left with a scowl that she filed away as a potential future problem and immediately set aside. When she turned back around, Marshall Mercer was standing where she had left him, holding his hat still, and there was something on his face that she could not entirely read: gratitude and something else, something older and less simple. He paid her the $40. She gave him Copper's lead rope. Their hands brushed in the exchange, which should not have been noteworthy and was anyway. "I'll be back through Cimarron next Friday," he said. "I'll stop in at the general store. If you leave word of your bank or your address, I'll begin making payments against the difference." "I told you that wasn't necessary." "And I told you it was," he said mildly. "To me." She almost smiled. She caught it before it fully developed, tucked it away. "The ranch is south of town, about 8 miles on the east side of the road. There's a gate with an L branded on the post, if you're ever in the area." "I might be," he said, and she had the distinct and unsettling sense that he meant it. She rode home that afternoon with 5 horses sold, a bank draft in her vest, and the persistent feeling that the day had gone both exactly as planned and entirely differently than she had expected. She paid the bank note the following week and felt the particular relief of a debt discharged, which was one of the finest feelings she knew. The ranch seemed to breathe easier after that, or maybe she did. She repaired the south fence herself with help from her ranch hand, a 14-year-old boy named Eli Garza who lived in town with his grandmother and worked for her 3 days a week in exchange for wages that were small but honest, and who had a natural ease with horses that she always found heartening to watch. She did not stop thinking about Marshall Mercer, which was inconvenient, and she was somewhat annoyed about it. She replayed the conversation at the auction with the critical eye she applied to most things and could find no obvious reason why it should occupy her thoughts the way it did. He had been polite, honest in a way that was unusual. He had looked at her horses with the right kind of eyes. He had offered $40 for an animal worth twice that and had not been embarrassed about the gap. He had simply named his truth and let it stand, which was a rarer quality than it should have been. She thought about the river gray of his eyes and then decided firmly that she was not going to think about that. There was plenty to occupy her attention. The ranch was entering its busy season, mares coming into foal, the new grass needing to be managed carefully so the pastures didn't get overgrazed, a dozen small maintenance tasks that multiplied as the weather warmed. She threw herself into the work with the total absorption that had always served her as both survival strategy and genuine pleasure. And for several days, she thought about Marshall Mercer only occasionally and with reasonable detachment. He showed up on a Thursday, not a Friday. She was in the smaller paddock working a young bay gelding through a series of ground exercises when she heard hooves on the road and looked up to see Copper's distinctive chestnut coat coming through the gate. She felt a small, traitorous leap in her chest that she immediately blamed on the surprise of it. He dismounted at the paddock fence and waited with the same unhurried patience she had noticed at the auction, and she finished the exercise she was in the middle of because she was not the kind of woman who abandoned a task halfway through, and also because it gave her time to compose herself, which she needed less than she would have liked. When she walked over to the fence, he had his arms resting on the top rail, watching the bay gelding with that expression of quiet attentiveness. "He's coming along well," he said. "He's got a good head," she agreed. "Spooks at loud noises, but he settles fast. Another month and he'll be ready for real work." "I came a day early," he said without preamble. "I had occasion to pass through Cimarron today, and I thought I would rather stop in directly than leave word at the general store." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a small fold of bills. $12, he said, "first payment." She looked at the money and then at him. "You didn't need to come in person for that." "I know I didn't," he said. He met her eyes and held them, and there was something there that was direct without being aggressive, the gaze of a man who had decided to be straightforward about something and was following through on the decision. "I also wanted to see how Copper had settled in." Which was an excellent reason, and also clearly not the only reason, and they both knew it. "She's done well," Abigail said, tucking the bills away without counting them. "How has she taken to the Rialto?" His expression shifted into something that was entirely unguarded and warm. "She's remarkable," he said. "I put her up against some of the roughest cuts on the south side of the property last week, shale ledges, steep drops, places where my old horse would have balked, and she never hesitated once. She's steadier than a rock, and she seems to think ahead of the cattle, which I've never seen a horse do quite that way before." "She does that," Abigail said, and despite herself she felt a swell of pride that was partly about the horse and partly about the fact that she had been right about him. "She's always been the smartest one in the herd. I always thought she deserved more than just showing." "She'll get it," he said. It was a simple statement and completely sincere. She believed him. He stayed for an hour. She showed him around the paddock, pointed out the foaling mare in the near pasture who was due in another week or two, talked about the breeding program her father had started and that she was slowly refining. He listened well, asked intelligent questions that indicated he understood horses from the working end rather than just the theoretical, and offered observations from his own experience that she found herself filing away as genuinely useful. She showed him the south fence she had repaired, which led to a conversation about the practical difficulties of maintaining property alone, which led to an unexpectedly candid exchange about the particular kind of loneliness that came with isolation, not in the social sense, but in the sense of having no one to share the weight of decisions with. She had not intended to be that honest, and found she did not regret it. He told her that he had bought his property from a man named Vickers who had gone broke trying to overextend his cattle operation in a year of bad prices, and that the land itself was sound, but the infrastructure was minimal: a small house, one barn, no bunkhouse, no secondary outbuildings. He had been building it up piece by piece on the income from his cattle, with very little left over for anything beyond the essentials. "What brought you to New Mexico?" she asked. "If you were established in Trinidad." "I wanted to own something of my own," he said again, which was the same answer he had given at the auction, but this time he added, "and the work I was doing in Trinidad was wearing on me. Deputy work is necessary, and I was good at it, but there's a kind of weight that accumulates when your job is to be present at the worst moments of people's lives. After a while, I needed to do something that was about building instead." She looked at the mountains behind the ranch and understood exactly what he meant and told him so. When he left, he said he would be back through the following month with another payment. She told him again that he really didn't need to. He gave her the same mild, unhurried answer. She did not argue a third time. Over the weeks that followed, she told herself several times that she needed to be careful. She was a practical woman with a ranch to run and debts recently discharged and future obligations to plan for, and getting entangled in something that had no clear practical future was not the kind of decision she made. She was not a woman who fell into things. She was a woman who decided, deliberately and with full information. But she found herself watching for the gate with the L brand on the post to swing open. She found herself making sure that, when she was out in the paddock on Thursdays, she was not covered in mud from the knees down, which was not her typical priority. She found herself looking forward to conversations the way she had not looked forward to anything social in a very long time. He came back in May, with another payment and a question about whether she had any advice on managing a mare who was showing signs of colic. She spent 45 minutes explaining every diagnostic step and treatment protocol she knew, and then she came out to his place with him, because she genuinely could not stand the thought of a horse suffering unnecessarily when she had the knowledge to help. The mare recovered fully within 2 days, which Abigail attributed to the treatment and Marshall attributed to Abigail, and the disagreement about this was the occasion of the first real laughter between them. The Rayado country was exactly as beautiful and demanding as she had remembered. His property sat in a fold between 2 ridges with a creek running through the bottom, and a view of the mountains that would have been almost theatrical if it hadn't been so obviously real. The house was small and spare but well kept, with the particular tidiness of a person who has few possessions but cares for each of them. There was a vegetable garden behind the house in its early stages, a barn that needed new boards on the south wall, and 40 head of cattle in excellent condition in the lower pasture. Copper was in the near paddock, and she came to the fence when Abigail approached and put her nose against Abigail's shoulder in greeting, which made something loosen in Abigail's chest that she hadn't known was tightened. "She remembers you," Marshall said, from just behind her. "Of course she does," Abigail said, scratching the mare behind the ear. "Horses remember everything that matters." "I believe that," he said quietly, and he was not talking about the horse. She turned around and found him closer than she had expected, not inappropriately so, but close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the quiet steadiness that seemed to be simply his natural state. He was looking at her with those gray eyes in a way that was perfectly clear and also perfectly patient, in the manner of a man who had something to say and was waiting for the right moment rather than filling the silence with less important words. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Marshall," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Marshall," she said, and his name sat in her mouth in a way that felt different from a formal address, weighted with something personal. "I need to be direct with you, please," he said, and he meant it. "I am not someone who does things halfway," she said. "I am not built for something that starts and then doesn't go anywhere. If we're doing this, whatever this is, I need to know that it's real and not just the result of proximity and convenience." He was quiet for a moment. The creek made soft sounds in the hollow below them. A hawk turned slow circles over the ridge. "I've been thinking about you since the morning of the auction," he said. "Not because you were near and convenient. Because of the way you stood at the paddock and looked at your horses like they were worth more to you than money. And then, because of the way you sold one of them to a man who couldn't afford her and called it the right decision, and looked like you genuinely meant it. And because every conversation I have with you makes me more interested in the next one." He paused. "I have thought about very few people in my life the way I have thought about you. So if your concern is that this isn't real, I can tell you with full confidence that, for my part, it is as real as anything has been." Abigail looked at him for a long time. She was not a person who cried, but she felt something behind her eyes that required careful management. "All right," she said. He smiled, that full, transformative smile, and she realized she had been waiting to see it again since the morning of the auction and had not acknowledged that to herself until precisely this moment. "All right," he echoed. She rode home that evening along the road south of Cimarron, with the mountains going gold in the fading light, and she felt something she identified after some consideration as happiness. Not the cautious, qualified variety she had grown accustomed to, but the simpler, more dangerous kind that doesn't bother with conditions. June came in warm and windy, the kind of New Mexico early summer that smelled of sage and new grass and the distant promise of afternoon thunderstorms. Marshall came to the Langston ranch every Thursday without exception, sometimes staying only an hour, sometimes staying half the day. He was always useful. He helped her post a new run of fence along the north pasture, helped her move the herd to the summer pasture, helped her with the 2 foals that arrived in the first week of June and required careful attention in their first days. He worked alongside her without making a production of it, without the particular variety of helpfulness that is actually about demonstrating capability rather than genuinely providing it, and she appreciated this more than she could easily articulate. She rode out to his place twice in June, once to check on a steer that had gotten tangled in wire, and once simply because he had asked her and she had wanted to come. The second time they sat on the porch of his small house after the work of the day was done, and watched the sun go down behind the Sangre de Cristo with cups of coffee and an easy silence that neither of them felt the need to fill, and she thought that this was what it felt like when something fit. Not the excitement of novelty, but the deeper satisfaction of something that was exactly the right shape. Henderson Cole appeared again in the 3rd week of June, and he brought unpleasantness with him the way he brought everything with money, and the assumption that money solved most things. He rode up to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 men she did not know and the expression of someone who has been reconsidering a grievance for some time and has decided to act on it. He was not overtly threatening. He was, in fact, scrupulously civil in a way that somehow communicated threat more effectively than plain hostility. He wanted the chestnut mare. He had done some research, he said, and it was his understanding that Abigail had overstepped the terms of the auction by withdrawing the animal after his bid was accepted. And while he had no interest in legal complications, he thought it would be best for all parties if the matter could be resolved amicably. He offered her $100 for the mare, a very generous price, and suggested that she pass the relevant sum along to the current owner as compensation for any inconvenience. Abigail listened to this with her arms folded and her expression very quiet. "The transaction was not complete when I withdrew the animal," she said. "I spoke with Clyde Harmon about this at the time, and he confirmed that the final transfer had not occurred. I refunded your bid in full and with an apology." "There is nothing to resolve." Cole's jaw tightened. "Miss Langston, I am offering you $100. "I understand the offer," she said. "The mare is not mine to sell. It belongs to Marshall Mercer." "Then perhaps Mr. Mercer would be open to a conversation about it." "That is his business," she said, "not mine. If you want to approach him, that is your right, but I will tell you that you will not be approaching him today or any day from this property." Cole looked at her for a long moment with flat, assessing eyes. The 2 men with him were very still in the particular way of men who had been paid to be still until told otherwise, which was information worth having. "You're making a mistake," he said finally. "I make my own mistakes," she said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Cole." He left, and she watched him go with steady eyes and a heart beating considerably faster than she was showing, and after his dust had cleared the gate, she went into the house and sat down at the kitchen table for a few minutes to let her hands stop shaking. She rode to Marshall's place the following morning and told him about the visit. She watched his face carefully as she spoke and saw it move through several stages: concern, the quick assessment of a man who had spent years in law enforcement and knew how these situations developed, and then a settled calm that was not indifference but resolution. "I appreciate you telling me," he said. "Cole is used to getting what he wants and he doesn't like exceptions. He'll try to pressure me next." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "He didn't touch anything. He was careful to stay on the right side of menace." She paused. "He's the kind of man who hires things done rather than doing them himself, which means the real question is what he'll decide is worth his money." "I know the type," Marshall said. He was quiet for a moment, turning something over. "I'll speak to the sheriff in Cimarron. Ben Aldridge, he's a reasonable man. I still have some standing from my time in Trinidad and he knows me. It's better to have the law aware of a situation before something happens than after." She nodded. It was the right move, sensible and experienced. She found herself thinking again how different it was to share the weight of a problem rather than carry it alone. The situation with Cole did not escalate into anything catastrophic. Marshall rode to Cimarron and spoke with Sheriff Aldridge, who had in fact already had some dealings with Cole regarding property disputes in the county, and was receptive to hearing about the mayor situation. Cole made one more attempt to reach Marshall directly, which Marshall declined with the same quiet firmness she had used herself, and then the matter appeared to simply subside. Cole was wealthy enough to purchase a dozen horses and had other concerns, and the pleasure of acquiring this particular mare presumably could not balance the complications of pursuing it past a certain point. It was in July, under a sky like a blue burning coal, that Marshall first took her hand. They were standing at the edge of the creek on his property, having come down from the upper pasture after moving a group of his cattle to the new grass. They were both tired and dusty, and the creek looked inviting enough that they had stopped without discussing whether to stop, and they stood there in the shade of the cottonwood trees listening to the water while their hearts came down from the heat of the work. He reached over and took her hand. That was all. He simply reached over and took it, the way you take something that belongs to you, not with hesitation or performance, but with the simple certainty of rightness. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and he laced his fingers through hers in a way that was so natural and so quiet that she felt it throughout her entire body. She did not pull away. She turned her palm against his and held on. They stood there for a long time with the creek running past them and the cottonwood leaves moving silver in the wind above, and she thought about what it meant to love something, how it was not a single moment but an accumulation, layer on layer, like the rings of a tree or the sediment of a river bed, each ordinary day adding its weight to the whole until the whole became something immovable. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have never in my life been tempted to stay in one place," he said. "Before I came here, I was always looking at the next thing. The cattle drive, the deputy job, the next county. I thought that was just who I was." He paused. "I don't feel that way anymore." She squeezed his hand. "I have always been in one place," she said. "I've never gone anywhere. I used to think maybe I should want to, but I think what I actually needed was someone else in the one place I have." He turned to look at her, and she was already looking at him, and the distance between them closed with the same unhurried certainty as everything else between them had not rushed, not uncertain, just inevitable. He kissed her in the shade of the cottonwood trees beside the Rayado Creek, and she kissed him back with her whole self, her hand still in his, the water still running, the mountains still keeping their long blue watch over the valley. Eli Garza, when he figured out what was happening, and he figured it out with the unerring radar of a teenager who notices everything, appeared to consider it the most satisfactory development in recent memory. He did not say this directly, but he started arriving earlier on his work days and staying later, and he took to addressing Marshall with the particular form of testing respect that teenage boys reserve for men they are considering approving of, asking him pointed questions about cattle handling and horse training, and once, out of nowhere, about the best way to deal with a man who had cheated at cards. Marshall answered every question with complete seriousness, and Eli Garza's assessment appeared to conclude favorably. August arrived in waves of heat that shimmered off the red earth and turned the mountains to mirages of themselves. And Abigail threw a 4th of July celebration 2 weeks late, because she had been too busy for it in the actual month of July. And this occasion brought in a collection of neighbors from across the valley who ate together under the shade of the big cottonwood in her front yard and played music until past dark. Marshall stayed the latest of anyone, helping her carry the last of the tables back inside when the lanterns were burning low. And when the house was quiet and the night was soft around them, he stood in her kitchen with his hat in his hands and said, "Abigail." Just her name, but in a particular tone. She turned from the kitchen table to face him. He looked at her the way she had learned to recognize as his serious face, not heavy, not fraught, just deeply present, attending to something that mattered. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I want to do it properly, with time for you to think about it and not in a rush. I want to tell you that I don't have a great deal to offer in material terms. A small house on a small property with 40 cattle and more years of work ahead than behind. But I can promise you that everything I build from here, I want to build with you. And that I intend to be the kind of man who is worth building something with." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. The lantern on the table made the room gold and warm, and outside the cottonwood branches moved against the window in the night wind. "Marshall," she said. "Yes. You don't need to give me time to think about it," she said. "I have been thinking about it since you showed up at my fence on a Thursday instead of a Friday." The smile broke across his face like sunrise, and she thought she would never get entirely used to it and didn't want to. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is very much a yes," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and she stepped to meet him, and he held her face in his hands and kissed her with an intensity that was nothing like the Cottonwood Creek kiss. That had been quiet and reverent. This was declarative, certain, joyful. And she laughed against his mouth because she was happy, and happiness, she was discovering, was not as complicated as she had always been led to believe. They were married in September of 1878 at the small church in Cimarron, on a morning when the aspens in the mountains had already begun to turn, and the whole world was going gold. Abigail wore her mother's wedding dress, which she had altered to fit herself with help from Martha Graves, who ran the dress shop in town, and who applied her professional interest in the affair with vigorous enthusiasm. Marshall wore a clean dark suit that he had ridden to Santa Fe to purchase, which Abigail only found out about later, and which struck her as entirely characteristic of him. The quiet, deliberate effort undertaken without announcement. Eli Garza was there in the front row, looking more polished than she had ever seen him, sitting next to his grandmother Rosalinda, who wept with a joyfulness that encompassed everything from the ceremony itself to the general improvement in conditions that love brought to the world. Sheriff Aldridge attended and brought his wife. Several neighbors from both sides of the valley came, and there was a reception at the Langston Ranch afterward with music and food enough for twice the number, because Abigail had cooked for a week on the theory that having too much was a far better problem than having too little. Abigail's brother Daniel had sent a letter from Philadelphia when she wrote to tell him about the engagement. The letter was warm and somewhat guilty, and full of questions. He had no immediate plans to come and ask in person, and she had written back a reply that was kind but honest in the way that only letters between people who know each other very well can be honest. He would come eventually. She would be glad to see him when he did. In the meantime, she did not wait on absent people. The question of where to live was solved with the straightforward practicality that characterized most of their decisions together. The Langston Ranch was larger and more developed than Marshall's Rialto property, had an established breeding program and an infrastructure worth preserving, and was Abigail's by inheritance and by the investment of years of her own labor. Marshall had no stake in appearing to own what his wife owned. He simply moved his 40 cattle to the Langston pastures in October, where they mingled with her herd with minimal drama, and he began to build the 2 additional outbuildings the ranch needed, and that he had been planning since he first looked at the property in early summer. He kept his rayado land, leasing the grazing rights to a neighboring family named Archuleta for a modest annual fee while he determined what to do with it long-term. The integration of 2 lives, 2 operations, 2 sets of habits and preferences was not entirely without friction. They discovered that they disagreed about the management of grazing rotations, about the right way to store winter feed, about whether the kitchen table was a reasonable place to spread out horse sale records or should be kept clear for actual meals. These disagreements were real and occasionally passionate, and they had them out in full because neither of them was the type to let things fester, and every single time they came out the other side having understood something better than they had before and with no damage to the underlying foundation. She had not realized until she lived it how much of being with the right person was simply about the pleasure of being known, the deep, specific satisfaction of having someone understand not just what you were saying but why you were saying it, and care about both. The foaling season in the spring of 1879 was the best the ranch had ever seen. 7 healthy foals, 4 of them fillies and 3 colts, every one of them strong and bright-eyed, and Abigail walked the pastures in the April evenings watching them run in the long golden light, with a feeling she could only describe as abundance. Marshall repaired the barn roof in March and built a proper tack room in April, and started work on a new bunkhouse in May, because they had enough animals and enough land that they needed regular help. And Eli Garza, who had turned 15 in February and was growing at an alarming rate, was working full days by now and beginning to show the particular talent with horses that Abigail had suspected was in him since she first saw him handle a nervous colt at the age of 13. She told Marshall she was expecting their first child on a June evening very similar to the evening of the July 4th party, or rather, the party 2 weeks after July 4th, sitting on the porch with the day cooling around them and the mountains going purple in the dusk. She said it simply and directly, as she said most things, and he went very still in exactly the way he had gone still at the auction when she told him she would sell him the mare for $40. She had learned to understand that stillness as the external sign of something moving in him, something real and deep making room for something new. He pulled her against him without speaking and held her with both arms, his face in her hair, and she could feel the evenness of his breathing and then the slight unevenness of it, and she thought she understood everything she needed to know about this man right there in that moment. "Are you well?" he asked after a while. "I'm perfectly well," she said, "strong as I always am. You'll tell me if you need anything." "You'll be the first to know," she said, and she felt him smile against her hair. Thomas Mercer was born in January of 1880, named for Abigail's father, in the farmhouse in the middle of a snowstorm that cut the valley off from town and meant there was no possibility of fetching the doctor in time. Rosalinda Garza, who had brought 6 of her own children into the world and assisted with a dozen more, was already at the house because Abigail had had the sense to ask her to come when the weather turned, and she managed the whole business with the calm authority of long practice, while Marshall stayed within 3 feet of Abigail throughout, and was, she told him afterward, considerably more useful than she had expected a man to be in that situation. Thomas was healthy and loud, and had his father's gray eyes and his mother's auburn hair almost immediately, which Rosalinda declared to be an excellent combination and a sign of good things. He was a solid, contented baby who ate and slept with great enthusiasm, and who regarded the world from his first week of life with an expression of interested assessment that made Abigail feel strongly that he had inherited the family quality of paying close attention to things. Marshall held him in the early hours after the birth, when the storm was still going outside and the house was warm and Rosalinda had gone to sleep in the guest room and Abigail was resting, and he sat in the chair beside the bed with Thomas in the crook of his arm and looked at this small person with an expression that Abigail, watching through half-closed eyes, did not have words for. It was something beyond happiness, something that made the world feel both very large and very small at the same time. Eli Garza met Thomas for the first time the following morning when the storm had cleared, and he arrived to check on the horses, and he stood holding the baby with the careful stiffness of a teenager who was not sure about babies but was trying very hard. And Thomas looked up at him with those gray eyes and grabbed Eli's finger with a grip of remarkable firmness, and Eli's entire face softened in a way that was funny and sweet in equal parts. "He's going to be good with horses," Eli announced. "Give him a couple of years," Abigail said. The ranch grew steadily through 1880 and into 1881. The breeding program produced horses that were developing a reputation across Colfax County and beginning to attract buyers from as far as Santa Fe and Albuquerque. And the prices they were commanding reflected the years Abigail had put into the bloodlines and the training. Marshall hired 2 ranch hands, Miguel Torres, a young man from the Mora Valley whose family had been in New Mexico for generations, and Pete Connolly, a quiet, competent man from Colorado who had come south looking for steady work and found it. The Langston Mercer operation, as people in the county began to call it, was becoming one of the more respected small ranches in the territory. Daniel Langston did come, eventually. He arrived in October of 1880 with a leather valise and a somewhat uncertain expression, and a quality of stiffness about him that Abigail recognized as the stiffness of a man who has been away long enough to feel like a visitor in a place he used to belong. She met him at the gate with Thomas on her hip and warmth on her face and no recrimination in her manner, because he was her brother and she loved him, and the past was finished. He stayed 2 weeks. He and Marshall found their way to a cautious mutual regard that began with the professional and moved gradually toward the personal, which was about the right pace for 2 men of that particular variety of reserved honesty. He played with Thomas with an awkward charm that made Abigail's heart ache a little because she could see the regret in him and also the genuine affection, and she thought he was beginning to understand what he had missed and what he might yet recover. When he left, he promised to return in the spring. He kept the promise. The summer of 1881 brought a letter that changed things. It came from a land agent in Santa Fe, addressed to Marshall, regarding a potential buyer for the Rayado property. The Archuleta family, who had been leasing the grazing rights, wanted to purchase the land outright. They were a good family, 3 generations in the valley, with the deep roots in the land that Abigail respected, and their offer was fair. Marshall brought the letter to her at the kitchen table after supper, with Thomas asleep in the next room making the small, contented sounds of a healthy child, and they talked about it over coffee for a long time. It was an important decision. The Rayado land was the first thing he had owned. It had a meaning to him that was not purely financial. "What do you want to do?" she asked him, which was always her first question on matters that were properly his to decide. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I've been thinking about it all day," he said, "and what I keep coming back to is that I came to New Mexico to own something of my own and build something of my own, and that's what I have here more than I had when I was trying to build it alone." He looked at her. "The Rayado land is a good memory, but the Archuletas would make better use of it than it's currently getting, and what I could do with the sale price here is real." A pause. "I think I want to sell it." "Then sell it," she said, "with my full support." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Do you know what I would have done with the money if I'd had it 2 years ago?" he said. She smiled. "Bought a horse." "Bought a horse," he confirmed, and the warmth between them was wide enough to fill the room. The Rayado sale closed in August of 1881. Marshall reinvested most of the proceeds in the ranch. A new breeding stallion with exceptional bloodlines from a farm in Colorado, an expansion of the foaling barn, and a proper irrigation system for the kitchen garden that Abigail had been managing with less water than she needed. The rest went into a bank account that he described simply as their future, by which he meant both the practical and the other kind. They hired Eli Garza as a full-time ranch hand at the beginning of 1882, when Eli turned 18 with the shoulders of a grown man and the hoarse sense of someone 10 years older. He moved into the new bunkhouse with Miguel Torres and Pete Connolly, and took to the formal role with the thoroughness and pride of someone who had been preparing for it his whole life. Abigail gave him increasing responsibility with the young horses, the training work that required the most patience and intuition, and he repaid her trust with results that made her genuinely proud every time she watched him work. She was expecting again in the spring of 1882, which she told Marshall in the same direct manner as the first time, on the porch in the evening, and which he received with the same deep stillness, and then the same encompassing warmth. Thomas was 2 years old and had developed strong opinions about everything in his world and the verbal facility to express them, which was exhausting, and also the most entertaining thing Abigail had encountered in recent memory. He had begun following his father around the property with the dedicated persistence of a small satellite, copying everything Marshall did with the solemn concentration of someone learning a language. Marshall managed this with an inexhaustible patience that made Abigail love him more every time she watched it. He never hurried the boy, never dismissed a question as too small, never lost the thread of genuine interest in the child's developing understanding of the world. One morning in early April, she was watching from the kitchen window as Marshall showed Thomas how to check a horse's front hoof for stones. Marshall crouched down to Thomas's level, Thomas's small hand placed carefully on the hoof under his father's larger one, both of them intent and serious about the task, and she stood at the window with a dish towel in her hands and felt something so large and quiet in her chest that she had to stop and simply let it be there for a moment. The second baby arrived in November of 1882. A girl this time, whom they named Elena after Marshall's mother, who had died when he was young and whom he spoke of rarely, but always with a gentleness that told Abigail everything she needed to know about the quality of what had been lost and what he was carrying forward. Dr. Harlow from Cimarron made it this time, no storms impeding him, and the whole business went smoothly and well. And Thomas met his sister with an expression of cautious scientific interest that was so entirely his own personality that Abigail laughed until her sides hurt from both the birth and the laughter, which was perhaps not ideal timing but was unavoidable. Elena was a different child from Thomas from her first hour, quieter in some ways and more watchful, with a quality of stillness about her, even as a baby that made you feel she was taking careful inventory. She had Abigail's auburn coloring, where Thomas had Marshall's darker hair, and she slept with the determined efficiency of a person who understood that sleep was a resource to be properly managed. Henderson Cole had left Colfax County the previous year, relocating his operation to Colorado following a run of bad cattle prices and some land disputes with the territorial government that had not resolved in his favor, and with his departure, a persistent low-grade tension in the back of Abigail's awareness had eased. The auction, and everything that had come from it, was fully settled and behind them. The territory of New Mexico itself was in the ongoing process of becoming. The cattle wars in Lincoln County to the south had been the bloodiest episode of a rough decade, and while Colfax County had its own histories of conflict and injustice in the years before, the immediate valley around Cimarron had settled into a working peace that allowed people to focus on the slower work of building. The land grant disputes that had torn the region apart in the 1870s left deep marks on the families who had been displaced, particularly the Hispanic families who had held land under Spanish and Mexican law, and found those claims invalidated by Anglo legal structures that many of them had never been party to. And Abigail had seen enough of this in her years to understand it as the kind of wound that did not close simply because people stopped talking about it. Marshall, who had the perspective of someone who had worked on both sides of law enforcement, held the same understanding, and they raised their children in the knowledge that the history of the land they loved was not simple. Miguel Torres, who had been with them since 1880, was a man whose grandfather's family had held land in the Mora Valley that was no longer theirs in any legal sense, and he spoke of it without bitterness, but with the particular clarity of someone who carried injustice as a fact of existence rather than a wound to be nursed. He was one of the finest ranch hands Abigail had ever worked with, and she paid him what he was worth and treated him as what he was, which was a colleague as much as an employee. And he gave the ranch 10 years of his working life, and the kind of loyalty that is built on respect rather than obligation. By 1883, the Langston Mercer Ranch had grown to 600 acres, purchasing the adjoining property to the east when the Weatherby family moved north to Colorado. The horse operation was producing 20 to 25 horses a year for sale, and Abigail had established a reputation as one of the most knowledgeable horse breeders in the territory, which meant that buyers came to her rather than her needing to take horses to auction. She had not been back to the Cimarron stockyards since that April morning in 1878, which she found pleasantly appropriate. She and Marshall had the kind of partnership that drew on each of them differently and equally. She led the horse program, he managed the cattle operation, and the ranch as a whole functioned as a single integrated system that neither of them could have run alone as well as they ran it together. Their disagreements had not become less frequent with time, but they had become more efficient, moving more quickly from position to resolution, because they had built up a working vocabulary for how each other thought. She had learned which of his quietnesses meant he was troubled versus which meant he was simply thinking. He had learned which of her certainties were true certainties and which were the initial position before she had heard all the evidence. They still sat on the porch in the evenings when the day allowed it, with the mountains going through their nightly transformation from gold to purple to the deep blue of almost dark. Thomas, who was 3 and then 4, and was developing into a child of remarkable and occasionally exhausting energy, ran the porch rail like a fence in fair weather. Alina watched everything from her father's lap or her mother's arms with those deep, cataloging eyes. In the spring of 1884, Daniel Langston announced in a letter that he was coming west permanently. He had finished his law practice and found it less satisfying than he had hoped. The letter was characteristically underdramatic on this point, simply stating the fact without the embellishment that would have made it easier to read, and he was ready to come home if there was room for him. Abigail wrote back telling him there was room. She meant it simply, and she meant it completely. He arrived in June, thinner than she remembered, and with a quality of relief in his face when he came through the gate that told her the years in Philadelphia had been the project of someone trying on a life that never quite fit. He was 31, unmarried, with the legal education and the Langston stubbornness, and the particular gentleness that ran in the family like a creek through stone. He and Marshall came to an understanding within a week that was warmer than their 1880 meeting had suggested possible, possibly because this time Daniel was not trying to assess his place in a situation and was simply present in it. Thomas adopted his uncle with immediate enthusiasm. Alina regarded him with the weighing look she gave to most new things, withheld judgment for approximately 3 days, and then began bringing him objects of interest from around the property, a particularly smooth river stone, a feather, a piece of quartz she had found near the north fence in the manner of someone sharing a serious collection. Daniel received each offering with the gravity it deserved, which completed Alina's assessment of him and secured his admission. Daniel set up a small legal practice in Cimarron, riding into town 3 days a week, and the rest of his time he helped on the ranch with the work of someone who had been away a long time and was finding his way back to what his hands remembered. He was good with the horses in the way that people who grew up around them are good, not with Abigail's deep expertise, but with a comfortable fluency. He met a woman named Clara Reyes in the autumn of 1884, the daughter of a blacksmith in town, and the courtship was slow and thoughtful and entirely characteristic of the particular variety of careful person that the Langston family seemed to produce. Abigail liked Clara enormously. She was direct, funny, with a laugh that was bigger than her small frame suggested, and she looked at Daniel with the kind of fond and slightly amused affection that suggested she had taken his measure accurately and was choosing him anyway, which Abigail considered the only reliable foundation for a marriage. They married in the spring of 1885 in the same church in Cimarron where Abigail and Marshall had married, which felt both fitting and circular in a way that pleased Abigail down to her bones. The ranch moved through its seasons with the rhythm of all working land, the intensity of spring and foaling and calving, the long labor of summer, the harvest and preparation of fall, the inward waiting of winter. Thomas grew tall and fast and turned out to have the same gift for horses his mother had, not just competence, but that particular frequency of understanding that made horses calm in his presence and willing in his hands. By the time he was 5, he was helping Eli with the foals in the paddock, working under supervision, with the same seriousness of purpose that characterized everything he attempted. Alina, at 3, was already demonstrating that she would be a different kind of horse person, more interested in watching and understanding than in direct handling, with an analytical interest in how horses moved and responded that made Abigail suspect she would be either a brilliant trainer or a veterinarian, depending on which direction her curiosity took her as she grew. Marshall turned 40 in the winter of 1885, and Abigail marked it with the kind of party she knew he would not have asked for and would be genuinely glad of neighbors and friends at the ranch, good food and music. Eli playing the guitar with a skill that had developed remarkably over the years, Thomas insisting on staying up past his bedtime by the simple strategy of falling asleep in a chair rather than his bed. Alina moving through the adult's legs with the serene confidence of a small person who knew this was her home and everyone in it belonged to her. Marshall stood at the edge of the porch in the middle of the party with Abigail beside him, and he looked out at the filled yard, the lights and the music and the children and the people who had become the fabric of their life, and he said very quietly, "Do you remember what I said to you at the auction? That I offered $40 for a horse worth twice that because I thought the world might work differently than it does just the once?" "I remember," she said. "I was right," he said. "It worked differently." She took his hand. "It worked exactly as it should have," she said. He turned and looked at her the way he had looked at her beside the Rayado Creek in the cottonwood shade, on the evening she said yes, in the morning light after Thomas was born, in 100 ordinary moments that were ordinary only in the way that the best things are ordinary because they are constant, because they are woven into every day. "I love you, Abigail," he said. "I know you do," she said. "And I love you. I have since before I admitted it to myself, which was irritating but appropriate." He laughed, the full, warm laugh she had also been collecting since the beginning, and she leaned against his shoulder and looked at her land and her life and her family in the lantern-lit evening, and felt the total sufficiency of it settle through her like warm water. The years that followed moved in the way that good years do, not without their difficulties, the territory still in the rough work of becoming, hard winters and hard markets and hard seasons that required everything a person had, but never with the particular weight of loneliness or the fear of carrying things alone. They added a third child in 1887, a boy named James, who arrived into a house that already knew how to be a family and took to it immediately, a cheerful and sociable baby who seemed to regard the world as a continuous source of excellent entertainment. Eli Garza had grown from a 14-year-old ranch hand into a 23-year-old, who was the best young horse trainer in the county, and knew it with the calm confidence of someone who had earned the knowledge rather than assumed it. He had been courting a young woman named Luz Archuleta, the granddaughter of the family who had purchased Marshall's Rayado land, with the same steady patience that characterized his work. And in 1888, they married, and Abigail felt the particular happiness of watching someone she had helped shape find the thing that would hold the rest of his life together. Daniel and Clara had a daughter in 1886 and a son in 1888, and the two families occupied adjacent portions of each other's lives with the easy comfort of people who choose each other's company as much as they are assigned to it. The extended Langston household was never loud in the dramatic sense, but was always full in the best sense, full of work and conversation, and the particular noise of children who are confident enough in their belonging to be themselves without performance. Abigail turned 40 herself in 1892, and she noted the occasion with the same unceremonious honesty she applied to most things. She was not as young as she had been, and she did not pretend otherwise, but she was also not diminished in any way that she could detect. Her hair had the first threads of silver in it which she wore without comment. Her body knew the work it did and was equal to it. Her mind was sharper than it had been at 20 because it had been used continuously, and in circumstances that required it to develop rather than simply maintain. On the morning of her 40th birthday, she rode Duchess's daughter, a mare named Duchess II, bred from the original and very nearly her equal, out to the south pasture before anyone else was awake, in the first pale light before the mountains had decided what color they were going to be that day. And she sat the mare on the ridge and looked at the whole of the Langston ranch below her, the expanded house, the 3 barns, the paddocks and pastures, the neat fence lines, the garden behind the house where Clara had planted rose bushes that were not yet blooming in this early spring morning, the cattle in the lower pasture, the horses in the upper. She thought about her father. She thought about the mornings he had ridden out on this same ridge when she was a girl, and how she had ridden beside him when she was old enough, learning what the land had to teach by being quiet and paying attention. She thought about the bank note, and the auction, and the $40, and the man who had looked at her horses with the right kind of eyes. She heard hooves behind her, and she was not surprised when she turned to find Marshall on a gray gelding named August, riding up the ridge toward her in the early light with 2 cups of coffee in a saddlebag that she strongly suspected had not survived the journey intact. He rode up beside her and stopped August next to Duchess's daughter and looked out at the ranch and the mountains and then at her. "Happy birthday," he said. "You brought coffee," she said. "I attempted to bring coffee," he said, and there was indeed a mild catastrophe in the saddlebag, but he produced 1 intact cup which he handed her and another that was approximately 2/3 present and which he retained for himself, and she laughed and drank the coffee and leaned her shoulder against his in the saddle. They sat there together on the ridge as the mountains found their color and the valley below them moved from shadow to gold, the ranch coming to life in the early morning, a horse moving in the far paddock, smoke beginning to rise from the house chimney where Rosalinda's granddaughter, who now cooked for the family, would be starting the stove, the distant sound of one of the boys already up and calling to something. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "The whole thing beginning to end." And she looked at the mountains, she looked at the ranch. She looked at the man beside her, who was 42 years old and still had those gray river eyes, and who had offered $40 for something worth more because sometimes the world works differently than it appears to, and had been right about that, and had spent the years since earning every dollar of the difference. "It's exactly enough," she said. "It's more than enough. It's everything." He reached over on the ridge in the morning light, just as he had reached over by the creek in the afternoon shade all those years ago, and took her hand. She turned her palm against his and held on. Below them the valley was fully gold now, and the mountains were blue and permanent and beautiful, and the horses were moving through the bright grass, and somewhere in the house Thomas was calling out and James was answering, and Alina's voice was rising above both of them with the particular authority of someone who has a great deal to say and intends to say it clearly. And the day was beginning as days begin, with everything still possible and everything already perfect, all at once. Duchess's daughter moved under her, shifting weight from foot to foot in the way of a horse that is comfortable and knows where it is. Copper's descendants were still in the herd, 3 generations on from the chestnut mare who had gone to a man with $40 and changed the trajectory of everything. Abigail thought about that sometimes, how a single choice, made in a single moment without full knowledge of where it led, could become the root from which an entire life grew. How you could not have planned it and could not have predicted it, and could only, in retrospect, recognize that it had been the right choice by everything that came after it. She had not sold Copper to the highest bidder. She had sold her to a man with gray eyes who looked at horses correctly and told the truth about $40, and had turned out to be worth considerably more than either of them had known on that April morning in the Cimarron stockyards in 1878. The debt he had insisted on repaying was long ago settled in full, but she had told him years back, on a quiet evening that she remembered precisely because she had chosen the moment with care, that she had never thought of the sale as a debt at all. She had thought of it as the best investment she had ever made, and the returns had been of a kind that no bank draft could measure. He had said he intended to keep paying it anyway. That was Marshall Mercer, a man who, once he had given his word, kept it past the point of necessity and into the territory of character. It was one of the things she had known about him almost immediately and had never stopped being grateful for. The sun cleared the mountain ridge fully and the whole valley lit up at once, sudden and absolute, the way the New Mexico light did when it meant business. She finished her coffee. She straightened in the saddle. She looked at her husband and he looked at her, and the look between them had all the years in it, all the work and the children and the arguments and the laughter and the creak in the shade and the kitchen table and the porch evenings and the mornings like this one. And it was not the look of two people still becoming. It was the look of two people who had become and knew it and were glad. "Shall we go down?" he said. "Let's go down," she said. They turned their horses off the ridge and rode down together through the bright morning to the ranch that was theirs and the life that was theirs, and everything behind them was accounted for, and everything ahead of them was open, and the gate with the L branded on the post swung wide.